Welcome again to the West Valley Center for Spiritual Living. It is our Sunday service in the morning in which we live stream from our hearts to yours. And we're so happy to be able to use technology to stay in touch. And I'm Reverend Karen Rice, and I am the spiritual leader of this community. What a great honor, and how wonderful it is to have stepped into some whole new way of doing ministry and to just see the consistency of an idea in the mind of God. And so we'll take a moment to turn within. I like to anchor the service before we begin, and if you'll just join me by finding that sweet center, that gorgeous way we pause and just know that right where we are, God is. And I just feel that love of God, and I recognize it as that activity of life. I know it is the wisdom of every word that desires to be spoken this morning, that desires to be heard, knowing that as we ground ourselves in spiritual principle, we certainly are given the way to put one foot in front of the other. I say thank you, life. I know this time is so very blessed. I let it be, and so it is. And so here we are, embarking on a brand new topic this week. Of course, I love to see the way the topics all seem to fit together, almost like puzzle pieces in a much bigger message, and I think that we can be confident that's exactly what's unfolding. The title of my message this morning is Rampant Imagination. And rampant imagination is a term that Dr. Ernest Holmes used. I came across it in his book, A New Design for Living, of which I'm taking many of the themes for my weekly messages throughout the weeks ahead and in the past. Fabulous book. I think it's a very timely read. It has a lot of information that helps me right now in being a spiritual leader as well as a participant of life. And in that book, Dr. Holmes had a subheading in one of the chapters that was entitled Rampant Imagination. And I'm intrigued with those words put together. And I see a way in which he was talking about something very important, something of substance for us that we can absolutely use in our understanding of sort of the spiritual advancement of our souls in this beautiful life where we're offered this opportunity for not only personal transformation, but this way we are collectively transforming ourselves and our lives in a much greater, broader way. And Dr. Holmes used the term rampant imagination to remind us of how powerful we are. That there is this spiritual tool of the imagination that taps into the divine, what the divine imagines for us and has imagined about us in all of its creations. And in that way, it becomes a God-given tool. Imagine that, using our imagination as a God-given tool. I really appreciate that idea. It implies such an opportunity for unlimited possibility. And so I looked in the glossary of terms. In the back of the Science of Mind textbook, there's this whole area of just defining words and themes. And indeed, Ernest Holmes had a definition for the word imagination so that we could look at it from a divine perspective. I was intrigued by that. You never know what you're going to find back there. It's a valuable part of the textbook we overlook sometimes. But here's what he said about imagination. We did not make life, but we can use it. And the way that we use it is through our imagination. At the root of the imagination is the wellspring of life and action. Oh, I love that. At the root of imagination itself is this great wellspring of life and a wellspring of action. And we really teach, as a part of our spiritual philosophy, we have an emphasis on how much good can you imagine? You know, we take the words of Jesus of Nazareth. It is done unto you as you believe. So how do we expand our beliefs? And we do that by having a greater imagination for what's possible. So if I look at the foundation of the science of my teaching, or religious science, I can see that we have these universal truths that other spiritual traditions, almost every spiritual tradition, aligns to these basic principles. And that is that we live in this intelligent universe that is created with this great evidence of divine order and how everything works in relationship to everything else. And that all of this was created by a loving creator. I love that idea that there's love and there's law when we're talking about elements of God, and that part of love reminds me that there is something that has created all life that is caring and supportive and certainly more powerful than we are. And the third point that I wanted to bring in terms of the foundational beliefs that support us in our spiritual walk of life is that idea of God and how we define what God is. I love that we are increasingly willing to have a greater understanding of how to define what and who God actually is. So for many of us, God begins as an entity that we envision to look sort of like us. And then as we deepen in our spiritual understanding and we see how there's an evolution of spiritual understanding upon all of us, that there becomes this greater and broader way to begin to understand who and what God is. And we begin to see that it's universal, and that even an atheist could align to that same truth, that God's not an entity, but that God is an energetic force. And in many ways, we have evidence by examining nature that this force is for life. In fact, it is a life-giving force, and we like to say, and we can use it. So then the next step is the way we align ourselves and our own God-given purpose to that greater divine purpose, and we make this beautiful union. I want to look at that today. How can we use our rampant imagination to greatly expand these beautiful ideas and this spiritual wisdom that's at the root of all faiths? Now, when I examined the word rampant, what I found was that in order to see it in a positive connotation, in the way in which Ernest Holmes is using it, it fits the synonyms such as flourishing, spreading, lush, and wild. Wow. Can we imagine life in such a flourishing way that we could see it as lush and wild and filled with endless potential, much of which we haven't even pondered yet? That's a gorgeous question for us to consider and to reconsider and reconsider again. Let me read to you another quote from Dr. Ernest Holmes on imagination. He said, "Imagination awakens within us all the inner forces of nature and then stirs into action our latent powers." I love that. Stirs into action our latent powers, which otherwise would never come to the surface. Do you hear what is being said here? That the very use of our imagination in a flourishing, spreading, wild, and wonderful way is the very thing that brings latent powers to the surface, where we recognize, wow, there's so much more we can do and so many other ways we can be and just show up and relate to other people as well as the experiences in our lives. So first we imagine things. We seed a thought, you might say. we begin to see things. We're actually encouraged to see things in the way we desire to experience them. And then as we continue to grow and anchor our beliefs in what's possible, and in that rampant imagination of divine possibility, we help to call things into reality, into being in this physical world. And so I do not think there has been a better time, although there probably have been lots of important times in the history of humanity, but this is one of those valuable, important times for us to just go a little wild and crazy in what we are willing to imagine for the future potential for all of humanity and for this planet. We are given a personal will, and I think that sometimes we get confused and we think that prayer is sort of willing things to happen. But our personal will is the way we have this opportunity to choose how we would like to direct the energy of our own life. I think that's a very important something to look at. How would you like to direct the attention of what you focus on, in which you would like to expand the good that you desire, not only for yourself, but this is a much bigger picture than that, isn't it? God-given imagination given to us with a full permission to use it, and the truth is we're using it all the time. And what that means is there are times where we want to really pay close attention and be choosy as to what we are imagining in our mind. Because as good and as much wonderful, positive things we can imagine, when we aren't paying attention, we can slip into the other side and imagine things that are not so good. It's like this spiritual path is an opportunity to refine our taste, right? Like the way someone who has learned to appreciate fine wine, we learn to have discerning taste. So we become aware of what we like and how that feels for us, and what we would like to, how we would like to participate in a greater way and have a deeper experience of that goodness, of that refined wisdom that comes with age, that comes with our experience of living through conditions in life. So we can develop a finer taste for living the good life. But I want to comment here that I don't mean the good life in terms of being rich or wealthy or decadent or having just fine things in your life. I'm talking about a much broader definition of a good life, living with good as your call and your meaning and your purpose, so that every day you not only experience more good in your life, but through that experience you bring more good to the planet. You bring sweeter relationships to the people you connect with in your everyday living. So we want to live for that kind of good life. When we do that, it's not accidental that other good things seem to show up, because we have tapped into a current of life that is based on this divine goodness. I want to speak about Dr. Kennedy Schultz for a minute. He was a minister in the early days of our movement, the Science of Mind teaching becoming sort of prolific, and lots of churches were opening and spreading across the country and eventually around the world. In his book called You Are the Power, love that title, You Are the Power, he has a reference to the way we should live only with life-giving ideas. See, here's another way of defining how we want to use that rampant imagination. Live only with life-giving ideas. So let's just pause for a moment and think about it. What does that mean to you? What comes to mind when I invite you to have life-giving ideas? Perhaps you can even think back this week See if you can think of an incident that unfolded this week in your own life where you know you had life-giving ideas. Oh, I wish we were together. It'd be so fun now to just call on people and hear what some of your responses are, because I know we're stimulating some good life-giving thoughts here, aren't we? And of course, I would invite you to notice as you can ponder a life-giving idea, or using your imagination in one of those life-affirming ways. I want you to feel how, where do you carry that in your body? How do you feel it in your being? Oh, that just feels lovely to ponder that. And then we also want to be aware of the opposite. The ideas that we consider at any given time that may not be life-giving ideas. Notice that life-giving has this, it implies an expansiveness, almost a freedom. And the opposite of that creates sort of an oppressed feeling for me when I think of that. And really, we have had a lot of reason to have those opposite feelings. You know, in the last couple of weeks, as we have watched the news, as we have been observant citizens and compassionate spiritual partners with each other in this path, we've been praying a lot for some of the sad things that have happened. So it would be normal to say that many of us have had moments of feeling overwhelmed. You know, if you're watching rioting and looting on TV and fires and chaos, that doesn't feel good. You know, those are not life-giving attitudes. And so we want to have that balance in our life where we use those moments, but we use them in a way that we pay attention to how they make us feel, so that we will know how we would like to redirect our energy and then eventually smooth ourselves in to that more refined, higher thinking, we sometimes call it, where we are looking at the life-giving ideas once again. See, life-giving ideas are empowering. They strengthen us. They soothe us and uplift us so that we're not in fear. And you know, I've been thinking, this is an important message, not just for what's going on in the world, but for health concerns you may have, for relationship struggles you may experience from time to time, for financial things that we look at. Dr. Kennedy Schultz actually said that life-giving ideas life-giving ideas permit us to know better than we knew before, to feel better than we have felt before, and to do better than we have done before. And I have to agree, just this exercise of sitting and feeling helps us to know better and to feel better. And if we know better and feel better, we will absolutely make higher choices in our doingness as we move about on the planet. Listen to this quote from Dr. Kennedy Schultz. A life-giving idea saves us from being oppressed. A life-giving idea saves us from being oppressed by the things that are going on in the world around us, so that we can rise above conditions. So know how you want to feel. If you're going through an experience that doesn't feel good, use that to know it's an opportunity to stop and ask yourself, how would I rather feel? And begin to imagine in that great, spreading, wise and wild and joyful way those feelings that you would rather feel, because that's what then infuses you with that activity of truth, that vitality of life that is fed by that life-giving imagination. We are talking about developing a consciousness of power. And when we are willing to step into a greater sense of power in our own life, we don't feel like a victim. And it then just creates this beautiful, vast openness for greater and greater possibilities. I also want to talk a minute about Richard Rohr, who is a Franciscan priest. He is a Christian mystic. He's a well-respected spiritual thinker that's current today. He's authored lots of books. It's uncanny how many books he's published in a short time, unless he's been publishing for a long time and we just didn't know about him yet. But the gift that Richard Rohr brings to us is a very unique take on the Christ consciousness. Now, the mystics, for hundreds of years, Meister Eckhart and Swedenborg and Teilhard de Chardin, they have all spoken to the same truths. We're looking at modern day. And just in the same way that Teilhard de Chardin had this urgency during World War I and World War II and the changes he saw in the world, and he was a Jesuit priest, just in the same way that he wrote about the Christ, he didn't term it the Christ consciousness yet, but we have evolved to where it's becoming a more commonly used term. And what's important is that we begin to realize that it doesn't represent Jesus alone, but it's a consciousness that we observed in the life of Jesus, and that we can aim to embody that same consciousness in our own life. So the Christ, Christ, we like to jokingly say, is not Jesus's last name. It's really about a consciousness. Okay, so back to Richard Rohr. He's delightful in his the way he stays so current in his message. And I was researching something and came across a blog of his that was fabulously interesting to me. And he was talking about quantum entanglement, which is a term that comes out of quantum physics. And quantum physics, as for those of you who know me, you know it is not an easy topic for me. It's one of those difficult things I have to work hard to talk about. But I loved how this Christian mystic, Franciscan priest, is talking about quantum physics, the science side of spirituality, and he's speaking to us in a very down-to-earth and understandable way. So here's what he had to say about quantum entanglement. Actually, I'm thinking that the entanglement in quantum physics, they talk about the way two or more, two things are having identical experiences, even though they're in separate, distinct, different places. And I'm thinking how fitting that is for that idea that's scriptural, where two or more are gathered. But he makes it even more down to earth than that. He is talking to us about a way in which we gravitate toward wanting validation, that all spiritual seekers seem to be hungry for some kind of validation or some kind of belief that assures us there are entities or angels, that there's some kind of divine intervention and that we are given the wisdom we need by whatever it is. So we're drawn to a channeled work, and we somehow give it an elevated sense of authority, even though it doesn't have to be that way. We could see the wisdom of so much information everywhere around us. So Richard Rohr says we like that stuff. We like feeling validated that something is divinely intervening on our behalf. We even like synchronicities, because we say, oh, there's no coincidence. It's God showing up, right? It's God validating we're on the right spot. And I do think it's important to open ourselves to the guidance of life. But then he does this profound thing. He says all of that, and then he says, what if, just what if it's actually more scientific than all of that? Well, I'm open to consider that. He says, in that space where spirituality and the world of science are beginning to overlap and complement each other in certain views, it's suggested that it's not providence, it's not God intervening. In fact, it's not anything supernatural, but it's some sort of implanted norm. Those are his words. It's not anything supernatural. It's not God intervening. It is actually some sort of implanted norm. See, we say this all the time. There's something already in us that's divinely, it's like that compass that when we tune into it, we then are in that current. We're in the flow of life, as Butterworth likes to say. Richard Rohr calls it the experiential force field of the Holy Spirit. You, of course, know I love that statement. The experiential force field of the Holy Spirit. This is so much like Teilhard de Chardin, the love of my life in the last few years, my favorite read when I'm home alone, pondering these big things. I love to go back to Teilhard because he's the guy that was a stretcher bearer in World War I. He was very young, a Jesuit priest, but the fascinating part of Teilhard is that he was a paleontologist. He studied geology. He really understood the biology of life, and therefore he could see evolution in a very broad spiritual way. He could see the way life is for us, and that there is this force in the universe that is always ongoing. And so my favorite statement from Teilhard is, "We are living in an unfinished universe." We are living in an unfinished universe. So how would you like to use your rampant imagination to reimagine what's possible? All of us are evolving, growing, changing all the time, because that's the nature of life. But how can we reimagine this world we're living in right now, knowing that something purely divine is desiring expression, right? That there's this glorious spiritual emergence that we are a part of on this planet right now. And as we are willing to sit and begin to image in our own minds, to tap into the divine imagination and see what greater things are right before us, how great can we imagine? And here's what I know. I can imagine, I can go pretty wild, but tomorrow I can imagine something even vaster and greater and more spectacular in this evolving soul of humanity. Teilhard de Chardin had a friend at the end of his life. He was celibate and never married, but he had a friend named Ida. And Ida was very intelligent, and they had lovely debates. It sounds like they didn't agree on everything. I wanted to bring this point forward because I think it's so relevant and helpful for me. There was one day where Ida and Teilhard were having this meaty conversation, and Ida was telling him how disturbed she was that despite all the turmoil that was going on in the world, that he was doing nothing. From her perspective, he was doing nothing. Now, she was quite an activist, though they didn't use that term, or at least she didn't call herself, she never referred to herself as an activist, but she certainly was actively involved in all kinds of ways to help make the world better. And she was frustrated that he was not showing up in the way that she was. And so these are the words that are recorded that she actually said to him. "I just can't understand your standing around with a holier-than-thou attitude when the world is in such a state as it is." And he thought about those words. We all do. Should I be doing more? And what he realized, and I love this part as a minister, I really love this to watch the process of his own thinking on such conversations. He realized that his work was totally focused on the same things that she was actively involved in. That he was always trying to imagine how to construct a future that would be more responsive to the Christ consciousness, so that the world would transform into a place where love dominates. That was his dream. I stand with him. That too is my dream. You see, he came to realize that he was building for the future while Ida was caring for the present, and that these were two different roles, yet there were both critical aspects of the bigger picture of working for the future. Here are some things Teard said in reference to World War I and how traumatic that was for him to be in the trenches as a stretcher bearer. So these are some of the things he thought about in those times. He said it's written that he sensed the times of global instability and unrest, that these were stimulants, they were opportunities for growth. They drive humanity from the relative equilibrium of everyday life, and they awaken greater responsibility in us for each other, for our future. And he notes that despite the horrors of World War I, mixed and welded together, the peoples of the earth, the horrors of the war itself are the very things that mixed and welded together the people of the earth in a way that nothing else could have done. And I really see that as something we are witnessing now. If we are awake, if we can use our rampant imagination in a broader way, we can see that this is another time in the history of humanity where something big is unfolding. He goes on to say this, and these are his actual words. What is the cause of this disorder in society? This uneasy agitation, these swelling waves, these currents? Mankind is visibly passing through a crisis of growth. See, he's stating this as he came to understand the way evolution of geology and biology, the biological aspects of the plant life and of the way even humanity, the way we're so miraculously created, the way we continue. He said, we are becoming aware of the shortcomings and our capacities for greater decisions. We can see that the universe is growing luminous like the horizon just before the sunrise. Let's use our imagination to see that these upheavals are bringing us to this luminous sunrise, this divine luminous sunrise that is filled with new potential, a different future. So as I thought about Ida and Teard arguing, it reminded me of another story that many of us are familiar with, and that is the relationship of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And so Thoreau was a student of Emerson's. He actually lived on Emerson's property when he wrote Walden. And Thoreau was an activist, and Emerson had slightly different ideas than of the way things should be done as compared to Thoreau. So there's this incident where Henry David Thoreau takes a stand. He finds out that the tax that they're paying is in part funding the continuation of slavery, and he puts his foot down and says, absolutely, I will not participate in that. And he decided to be what they called a tax rebel, so he refused to pay the tax and found himself in jail. So he was only in jail for one day. He really wanted to be there longer, but his family apparently bailed him out. While he was there in jail for that single day, Ralph Waldo Emerson came to visit him. Now imagine, Emerson is his teacher, his mentor. Emerson walks in, and he looks at Henry behind the bars, and he says, "Why, Henry, what are you doing behind those bars?" And Henry David Thoreau popped back by saying, "Waldo, what are you doing on the other side of those bars?" So they didn't agree but we see that it's the same picture. You know, Henry is back there going, no, we got to fight, we got to do things. And Emerson is saying, oh, we have to look at the bigger picture. Emerson felt that society required an entire rebirth of spirituality and that was his job. So these ideas piggyback on everything that I spoke to last week, but are a lovely way to wrap up this conversation about our rampant imagination in the ways we can contribute to the flourishing of all the good on the planet. You know, Ernest Holmes, Dr. Holmes, said that we need to allow nothing to pass through the currents of our thought until we have analyzed it, dissected it, and made a decision about what it means to us. Let's use that rampant, that flourishing imagination in that process of dissecting and analyzing and choosing where we stand and how we show up. And then I would like to close with a final quote from Dr. Holmes. I believe I have shared this before. I probably will bring it again. It's just such a beautiful, inspiring quotation that fits this topic. He said, "We must relight the torch of our imagination. We must relight the torch of our imagination by fire caught from heaven. We must remain faithful to this vision, for a realization of the presence of God is the greatest power we can have." So knowing there is power and truth in the words of prayer, I would like to take us to that inner place of preserving, perhaps even grabbing that tiny thread of truth that fed you this morning, that place where you want to sit with your imagination and expand what's possible. Let's just breathe and recognize the indwelling presence of God. I just feel the love of God within me. And how wonderful it is to know again that there is no place where God is not. There is an indwelling presence, and then there is that way in which God is absolutely immersed in everything we could see or touch or imagine. We are given this gorgeous gift of imagination to be used in an empowering way. And so we use it this day. We take these words, we take these ideas, and we seed them so that they might blossom in a life-giving way that serves us, to aid us, to nurse our fears or our concerns for the planet, so that we create a spaciousness to imagine the greatness that is trying to emerge, something wonderful that is birthing on this planet even now. As we align ourselves to that current, that flow of life, that revealing of this deeper and greater truth, we now stand in principle. We are part of the risen consciousness. We come and rise above 51% of the population so we can do good work in this world, so that we can know that that which we can imagine is what is being called forth. It is that which the Creator desires for this planet to have in this way that we are moving and evolving. And still we remember we are in choice, and we align our powerful, positive ideas of choice for the future of all of us. We align them in such a way that we realize again we live in an unlimited universe that is blessing us and conspiring to shower us with even more blessings. I say thank you, God. I open myself to receive these gifts as we as a community open ourselves to receive this good, and we stand here taking it in. It is the grace of God. We do good work with this gift. We do good work in the world as we align our consciousness to that divine consciousness. I say thank you, God. Thank you, life. Thank you, infinite spirit. I know we are blessed for this week, and that we stand in this power of prayer knowing all is well and feeling that gratitude just moving and quickening within me. I speak these words of release, releasing and letting go knowing that our good returns to us multiplied abundantly by this certain principle we call the law. I let it be done, and together we say, and so it is. And talking of abundance, it's time for our sharing. Remember that you can come by and drop your offering by. You can get online. We have a donate button on our website. You can mail in your offering. I'm putting mine in the offering plate to prime it in case you want to come by. And I would say that if you haven't been by the building in the last 2 days, it would be really worth it and much fun for you to drive by and drop your offering off in person, because the building is being painted. In fact, it appears the front of the building is already done. And as we step into this week of change and beautifying and infinite possibility, I think we're going to be done this week. It looks really exciting. Inside, outside, massive change going on. And also remember, we have posted a survey in last week's newsletter, and we're going to keep that survey up for another week or so, because we want to know what your level of comfort in returning to meeting again in person in our sanctuary. Give us your feedback. We're going to really use that. Oh my goodness. I remain so excited. I carry with me this joyous expectation for the future of this community, but even more so for the future of humanity, this world, this planet. So join me this week, every chance you get, for loving. I love you. Namaste.